Hello everyone, you're here sewing with Cody. In this video, we're working on block 4 of our Quilt Along Lazy Star quilt. So we've already done block 1, 2, and 3. Now we're working on block 4. Block 4 was one of my favorite blocks that I did when creating the quilt, using the Lazy Angle quilt ruler by Creative Grid. It was just such a fun block. So I'm looking forward to recreating it with y'all. So just like all the other blocks we've done so far, these 4 that are in the center, these are all 10.5-inch blocks before we put them in the quilt, obviously. So they're cut at 10.5 inches, and we're using 5.5-inch smaller blocks to create this block. So that's what's nice about all the blocks that we're doing, is we're only really creating one smaller block and then just reproducing it to create the entire full block. So let's get started at creating block 4. So here we have our 5.5-inch strips. These are actually leftovers from another block. So to create block 4, what we're going to need is we're going to need 4 large trapezoids from the background. So let's go and cut those. We're going to cut those on the 5.5-inch marking, just like we've done with all the other ones. So we've got 2 there. Then we can go and rotate our ruler, line it up with a 5.5-inch. And we've got 2 there. So we can set those aside. But we also need 4 smaller trapezoids. So let's see if we can get those out of here. Well, looks like we'll be able to get 1. Well, 2 of them. So we'll go line it up with the 5.5-inch marking here. So we'll cut that. Oh, we might be able to get, let's see. So that we can flip the ruler so we can deal with our markings on the back side. Oh, look at that. Perfect. And I'm sure y'all will have plenty of strips left over from your other previous blocks as well. So then now we have 4 large white background trapezoids and 4 smaller backgrounds. So now we can move to our fabric A. And then so here we're going to cut 4 smaller trapezoids. So we line it up with our 5.5-inch marking here. Cut. And we can flip. Line it up from the back. Cut, and there we are for fabric A, and then we're going to need 4 from fabric B. Line up with our 5.5, flip the ruler, and then we're going to cut 2 more. So there we are. Here are our 4 fabric B, 4 fabric A, 4 background fabric of small ones, and then 4 background fabrics of the large ones. So now what we're going to do is we're going to take our background large trapezoids and we're going to piece fabric A to that. And we're going to do this for all of them here. So I've got my pins. You know, I like to pin them together. So we want to make sure, like we've done with all of them, is make sure we have our little dog ears here at the top and at the bottom when we line them up. And give it a little pin. All right. So we've got all 4 of them pinned. So we'll go to the sewing machine and sew these down. And then we can go and press them at the ironing board. So here, we've got them laid out. We're at the sewing machine with our 1/4-inch foot and our straight stitch plate, which is very important. So if you don't have your straight stitch plate on, please put it on now, definitely. And make sure you tell your machine, depending on what machine you're working with, of course, tell your machine if you can that you're using your straight stitch plate. If you don't have a straight stitch plate, You can sew a little leader, so you can have a little piece of fabric you can start sewing on, and you can lead off of that onto here. It just helps you prevent the fabric from being pushed down into your larger opening if you have one. But your straight stitch plate is a must-have when you're piecing a quilt. It's just a lifesaver for sure. So remember, when we start sewing, we really want to make sure we get that needle in this little crevice, and that means we have the right amount of fabric up here. But of course, we want to make sure we stay along this 1/4 inch marking. I'm sorry, we want to make sure we keep the edge of our 1/4 inch foot along the edge of our fabric to ensure that we have a perfect 1/4 inch. But as you can see here, we can see like right at that little corner, like right where those two pieces meet, is right where the needle's going to start stitching. And that's perfect. So now that we have them all sewn, we'll take out our pins and we'll separate our little chain pieces just by trimming them up. And then we'll go to the ironing board and then press these seams out. And again, we're going to press them to the dark side. Just like that. So let's go to the ironing board. So here we're at the ironing board and we have our pieces that we've just sewn together. So we're going to press these so they're pressed to the dark side. And we'll do this for all 4 pieces. And like I always mention, is make sure that you press these seams flat. You don't want any little folds in your seam. I see it all the time when I'm quilting customers' quilts, where the seams just don't get pressed out, and then you've got extra fabric or you've got a lip, and it just doesn't work out well for the piece. So you always want to make sure that they are completely pressed back. Your iron is your best friend when you are piecing a quilt. It allows you to get your seams nice and flat and pressed out perfectly. All right, so now we're ready to go back to the cutting board, and we're going to trim a section of each little block off before we sew on our next piece. All right, let's go see. Okay, so here we are back at the cutting table, and so what we're going to do first, something I always like to do, I always like to trim off my little dog ears or little pieces here. And you can use a ruler, but a lot of times if everything's nice and straight, I'll just trim them off. So once I have them all trimmed up, and definitely something else you should do is make sure that you have a 5.5 inch square, because these should equal a 5.5 inch square, or pretty close. Yeah, perfect, 5.5 inches. You can go and check each one. Now, if they are less than 5.5 inches, you want to make sure that you have a perfect 1/4 inch, and you want to make sure that they're completely pressed back and out, because if you didn't press them like I mentioned at the cutting table and you have that little bit of a lip, if you press them completely out, they'll get to the size they need to be. But you don't want to stretch your fabric. So now we're going to trim. So if you're ever wondering exactly where you should trim, you should look at your finished, like the picture of the finished block. And so you've got this piece, so we're going to know this one's next. So you can always lay it out and kind of figure out what the block is supposed to look like. So this is what the finished block is going to look like when it's all said and done. So this is our next piece. So we know we need to cut this angle here. So we're going to rotate the block, and we know, okay, here is our angle. So what we're going to do is line up the 5.5 inches, because everything we're doing with 5.5 inches. So we're going to line up our left and our bottom side here, and you can see this is where the fabric B piece is going to go. So we're going to cut this off, because whenever using this ruler, we're always cutting from this side or this side. We're never cutting from the other sides. So we're just going to give this a little cut. And so you can see here, this is the next piece that's going to be sewn onto the block. So what we can do is we can set that aside and go and trim the other 3 blocks. And like I mentioned in other videos, you're going to have at the bottom corner here, it's not going to come to a point anymore. It's going to be squared off, so don't panic when you see that. That's just how it is. Okay, so we've got all of our pieces. So let's pin my pieces on. So remember, it's going like that. So let's pin down here along that cut edge and make sure we have our little triangle at the top and then we're lined up at the bottom. And like I've mentioned before, I like to pin in this manner so I can leave my pin in while I'm sewing, so it's not going to interfere with the foot at all, the presser foot. So as long as you're pinning it far away enough from the edge, you shouldn't have a problem. You should have no interference with it. All right, so I'm gonna go to the sewing machine, sew 1/4 inch down each side, and I'll meet you back at probably the ironing station. So here we are back. We're at the ironing station. So I sewed 1/4 inch down this edge here. So now we're going to press it. And remember, always pressing it to the dark side. So in this case, it's going to be towards our fabric B, in this case, like that teal blue fabric. And we're just going to hit it with the iron and make sure our seams are nice and flat. And we're just going to do this for all 4 pieces. So now we're going to go back to the cutting table. We're going to trim off all these little ears. And we're going to square up our block if it needs to be squaring up at all. And then we're going to cut one more piece off of here. And we're going to sew another little small background piece to it. And that's going to finish our block. It's quite simple, but it's going to give us a really, really cool looking block. Absolutely love it. So let's go to the cutting table and take a closer look. So here we are, our cutting table again. So we just pressed our fabric B down. So now what we're going to do is we're going to trim off all these little dog ears. Just because I like to keep it nice and clean. And you can always measure your block to make sure it's measuring still at the 5.5 inches. So now what we're going to do is we're going to trim off another section of the block. So this is what we have our block looking like so far. So what we're going to have it do, the last thing is we're going to sew this on in this section. So this section is the side that we're going to cut off of here. So to give you an idea of how we're going to do this, is so we can lay it like this, and then so we know it's at an angle, so we're going to want to cut that off. So what I like to do here is so I can lay my ruler and see the angle and the side that I need to cut. So I know I need to flip this way so I can cut this off, lining up at the 5.5 and the 5.5. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm lining up the left edge. So remember, I've got the wrong side of the fabric. You can see my seams here. I'm lining up the left side with the 5.5 and the bottom with the 5.5, and then I'm going to cut this off. I can come and check, and so this is what it's going to look like. Perfect. So I can set this aside, and I can go and do the same thing. So flip, and then we're going to come here, line up 5.5, 5.5, and we're going to trim. It's always best to double check to make sure you're cutting it right. It can never hurt to double check. I know I've cut them wrong before. Then you gotta go and remake everything. So here, we're just about done. So we're going to take our, so we can see here, we can lay our piece about where it needs to be, and that's our finished small block. So now we can lay each of them down, making sure we have that small little dog ear. So our needle can start right where they intersect, or end right where they intersect, depending on which side you start from. And go and lay all the other pieces. And then once you sew these, you are going to take it to the iron press. And then we'll sew the finished small blocks to create our finished large block. So let's go. I will meet you back at the ironing board. But just remember, we're just going to sew down here for each one. All right, let's go. All right, we're back at the ironing board. So you can see I've got my pieces nicely sewn down. So here is where there really isn't a dark side to fold this to. There is one side that may be better than the other, but we're going to go a slightly different direction with that. So as you notice, we've got white and we've got white, and so there's really no dark side. So I can definitely press it this way because I've got a little dark section here, so less would show. However, since regardless of which way I show it, there's going to be quite a bit of that seam visible, I'm going to press it towards the direction it naturally wants to go, and that is towards the light side. Because we've got this seam coming here, it wants to naturally fold that way. So we're going to let it do it. It'll lay a little bit better going that direction, and we're just going to see that seam underneath this fabric all the way across. But either way, we would have seen most of it. So we're just going to give this a press on all of them. Let's make sure those seams lay nice and flat and they're nice and open, but pressed to one side. And so now we're done cutting, except I still like to trim my little ears here, but we're going to go, actually we don't need to go, yeah, we'll go to the cutting table. I'm just going to trim these off, and then I'm going to show you the direction which to piece it. All right, let's go see. All right, we are back at the cutting table. So I mentioned the only thing we have to cut now is just to trim up our block, make sure we can square it up to make sure it's 5.5 inches. And just check it. If it's a little off, it's not that big of a deal. It's fabric, we can get to stretch to the size we need it. So here we are. So we can lay out our blocks in the correct orientation. And here it is. So this is one of my favorite blocks we've done so far. It's just a really neat pinwheel star kind of block. So what we're going to do, just how we have it laid out, we're going to fold this over, and we're going to we're going to pin. Once we have everything lined up, give that a pin. And we'll do the same thing to the top section. And then we'll go over to the sewing machine and sew each section down. And then we'll come back and sew the top and the bottom together after we press those seams. All right, I'll meet you at the sewing machine. Okay, we're at the machine. And we're just going to make sure that all of our edges and sides line up nicely. And we're just going to stitch them with 1/4 inch just like we've been doing. And if you haven't seen my video about the By Annie stiletto, you have to go watch it. I'll link it at the end of this video so you can easily find it. This stiletto is awesome because of its gripped point. It makes it a lot easier to grip and pull your fabric where and when you need to. And it just doesn't poke through the fabric. And take our pins out, separate the blocks, and now we're going to go to the ironing board and press. But what we're going to do, just like we do with all the other blocks, so here's the top and here's the bottom. So we're going to have one of these seams, we'll have the bottom one go to the left, and we'll have the top one go to the right. Just because this is all dark, so we'd have that seam pressed underneath the dark side here, and the same thing for this side. And that will allow them to interlock, just like we've done with the previous blocks. All right, so here we've got our top and our bottom section of our block sewn together. And we also have those seams pressed. So you can see we're pressing it to the dark side. So for the bottom one, it's going to the left. For the top one, it's going to the right, which then will allow us to interlock our seams. So we've got a seam going to the left and a seam going to the right. So those seams will interlock nicely. And so it's going to pin it up and then go and sew it down. And that'll meet you over at the ironing board to press those seams open to see our finished block. All right, so let's give these a pin so they stay where they need to stay. And I'll go sew them down and I'll meet you at the ironing board. And we'll press these seams open to finish our block 4. So here we are, ready to reveal this seam. So I'm going to give this a little press here. So we've got the seam sewn down from our top and our bottom pieces. So if we open it up, you can see our block here. Looks nice and pretty, and our points are nice in the center. So what we'll do is we're going to, like we've done in the past with our other blocks, is this particular seam, we're not going to press to either to one side or the other. We're going to open up that seam and we're going to press it flat. It will allow these seams to lay a little bit flatter. So just press this seam open. Just like that. So we flip it open. There's our seam. Looks nice and pretty. There is our finished block. So we've just finished block 4 of the 11 blocks that we'll be doing for this Lazy Star quilt along. So here, this should measure a 10.5-inch square block using the 5.5-inch smaller blocks and the 5.5-inch marking on our lazy angle ruler. So we'll start preparing and get ready for next week's block, which we're going to switch it up a little bit. We're actually going to change the size of our blocks. So block 4 is the last of the 10.5-inch blocks using the 5.5-inch marking on our lazy angle ruler. Next, we're going to be downsizing a little bit. So our pieces are going to be a little bit smaller. So if you, hopefully, you enjoyed making this block, and maybe this is also your favorite block that we've done so far, like it is mine. But next week we will be switching up, like I mentioned, so I'm excited to play with those as well with y'all. So if you enjoyed this block, making this block, give the video a thumbs up, and of course if you're not already subscribed to the channel, subscribe. Check out the blog for the written instructions with all the pictures included. You can always come back and reference this video. You can watch as many times as you want. And that's it. So, as always, happy sewing.